All right, we're waiting on the Congresswoman. And there she is. Testing. Congresswoman, can you hear me?
I can, TJ. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you doing? And with all the pandemic and everything that's going on, how are you doing?
You know what? I'm tired, but privileged to serve. I'll put it that way. We have a lot of work to do, as you well know.
Indeed.
How have you been? You look
I've
good. Look at you.
You've been doing okay. You know, I'm a little more fluffier than normal because of the quarantine, but I'm doing good. I'm doing well. But I know
that's it. Thank you for giving me that excuse. Thank you. Okay, that's it.
Yes, indeed. So I know for those who are not familiar, because we have welcome to the Soapboxx podcast. For those who are not familiar with Congresswoman Val Demings, she's a congresswoman for District 10 in Florida. And so I know we're limited in our time. And so usually on the Soapboxx, there's a lot more, dare I say, pleasantries, but I know we have to have, a conversation giving the current climate of the country. So I wanted to make sure that I preface that before we get started. So it's not an attack. It's just,
I'm ready. I'm ready.
We're here for uncomfortable, conversations, authentic conversations as well.
That's right.
All right. So I wanted to speak with you before we get into the the VP contendership. Right now, currently in this country, it seems like we are at a crisis in confidence when it comes to law enforcement. We've had demonstrations. There have been protests around the world. Supporters of the Black Lives Matter movement. You have served 27 years in law enforcement, 4 years as an Orlando police, first ever female Orlando police chief. But I wanted to ask you, with everything that's going on, have you had a time to do some soul searching and asked yourself personally, have you contributed to any of the unrest in that current crisis when it comes to law enforcement?
Well, TJ, first of all, let me thank you for inviting me on the Soapboxx. I appreciate having this opportunity to have this discussion because it is so very critical. I spent 27 years at the police department, as you well know. I had the honor of serving 4 years as the chief of police. Before I became a police officer, I worked as a social worker. And one of the things that I clearly understand and tried to do at the police department was, if we're going to have any chance of solving some of the major problems that we have in this country, it's nothing new. We've been fighting against racism, systemic racism for 400 years, I would say. But we've got to make sure within our corporations, whether they're Fortune 500 companies or in public institutions, law enforcement and other governments at all levels, that we've got to hire people that reflect the diversity in which they serve in the community. Whether you're Absolutely. A private company or a police department, those entities ought to look like the community. And so I'm glad to have had the opportunity to also hire African-American officers, those even in civilian roles, to help do the job. Look, policing, as you well know, history does not have the best history in this country. But I have to believe that things got better when we hired Black people, Hispanics, and others to help do the job. As a leader, if you're serious about doing the job, I think there are always opportunities. Never, ever have we arrived, if you will. I had a 40% reduction in violent crime. I inherited one of the highest crime rates in the history of the city.
43.6.
Yeah, but you know what? I didn't leave the agency saying, oh man, that was great. I did the best job ever. Everything was perfect. It couldn't be, because it wasn't a perfect institution.
Absolutely.
And so there are always areas where you can improve. I tried to improve our policies. I certainly tried to improve things in hiring, like I said, with diversity. Certainly wanted to make sure that all communities were safe. That's why I worked so hard on the crime rate, because those were young Black people who were dying in our streets for the majority. And so could I have done more? As every good leader would say, there's always opportunities to do more.
What are those things that you think you could have done better as Orlando police chief in hindsight?
Maybe, gosh, I was a quiet, if you talk to the men and women in OPD, Many of them thought I was a black bitch because
Mm.
I was really, and some of them called me that. They thought behind my back, but anyway, because I was really a hands-on kind of chief. I was serious about accountability. I was serious about people not being lazy and doing what they were supposed to do. I used to talk to the officers daily, TJ, about treating people with dignity and respect. Look, I grew up in Jacksonville. I was called the N-word when I was 4 years old for the first time. I don't think there's any of your listeners who believe there is one day that I wasn't reminded. Yeah, I was the chief, but that I wasn't reminded that I was black and female. And so it was a tough place to be. But I think, I gave it everything I had. I guess you can always look more at policies, which I did. I started an early warning system that was designed to help the department better identify officers who were maybe giving signs of having problems. I was glad to have instituted that. And so, I think that every leader probably could do a little more, work a few more hours, look at a few more policies. I spent a considerable amount of time with the officers because I didn't just talk to them one way. I wanted to see what they were doing. We did an occupation at the Palms Apartments to make sure that not only we reduce crime in the Palms, but that their quality of life
we
was
played
improved.
the
I would have liked to have been able to do more in other areas. Because we realized we couldn't just arrest our way into a better community. We had to deal with the social ills. If I could have done the same thing in the Palms that I did in other areas to improve the quality of life, that would have been great as well. I wish I had an opportunity, as opposed to inheriting some problem officers, maybe having an opportunity to hire more great officers. And then, TJ, as you well know, we have something called the Officer Bill of Rights. It's not as simple as saying police executives.
Everybody knows I'm well familiar with the
Oh
Officer
my
Bill of Rights.
God.
But speaking of bills, I wanted to touch base on, because I know a lot of, I come from an activist background. And
I know you do. And thank you, by the way, for that. I appreciate you doing that.
Yeah, well, it's my call to service. And so your call to service is as a congresswoman. But in 2018, as a congresswoman, you were the sole sponsor of the Protect and Serve Act, which is otherwise known as the Blue Lives Matter bill, which came with a 10-year mandatory minimum for any bodily injury on a police officer. That's been since that bill was criticized by the ACLU, Human Watch, also the NAACP, as a way to further criminalize marginalized communities, as well as the Black Lives Matter protesters. So, given in the conversation that we're having, in hindsight, do you regret co-sponsoring that bill?
You know what, I don't, TJ, because I never saw that bill as the Blue Lives Matter. I know that others did. When I co-sponsored that bill along with John Rutherford, who's out of Jacksonville, my hometown, it was the Protect and Serve Act to me. But I'm going to tell you, one of the first things I did after being sworn into Congress, I always thought about what my first floor speech would be. The first time that I spoke on the floor of the House of Representatives, I always thought about what it would be. I thought it would be about healthcare. I thought it would be about infrastructure, or I thought it would be about improving education. My first House speech, TJ, was following the brutal murder of my friend and colleague, Deborah Thomas, OPD sergeant. And it broke my heart. And so, also on the same day, an Orange County deputy, African-American deputy, was killed on his motorcycle as he was trying to find the suspect in that. I really looked at the Protect and Serve Act as a way actually to honor Deborah. It was right after her tragic death. We were all grieving and hurting. What I can tell you, though, now we have a different focus. I've helped to put the Protect and Serve Act on a back burner while we focus on police misconduct and the Justice in Policing Act.
Yes.
Because what we have seen, look, yeah, I spent 27 years in law enforcement and the first woman, and I'm so proud of that because I helped to integrate the police department and make it better. But what happened to George Floyd was brutal, it was senseless, it was murder, and we've got to do something about that.
I'm glad you brought up George Floyd,
Yeah.
because I think sometimes in the conversation, Breonna Taylor gets lost in the
Oh
conversation.
no, and I was just getting ready to go to her.
But
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, do you think that the officers who killed Breonna Taylor, should they be arrested?
Let me tell you what I think. And certainly I think it's so good to have a social worker's perspective, but a police perspective from the inside. I know police and I know the challenges and the joys and pains of the job. And back to George Floyd, what happened to him was dead wrong. It shouldn't
Absolutely.
happen. And the people responsible should be held accountable as they are. I also talk quite a bit about Breonna Taylor because I always say when bad things happen at the police agencies, it's one of three things. It's either bad mind, you have somebody who just does not have the cognitive skills and mind to make great split-second decisions, or bad heart, maybe you're a racist, and certainly racists don't need to be on the police department, or bad policy. I believe in the Breonna Taylor situation, another tragic situation, bad policy, no-knock warrants are dangerous. And let's think about it. You know, everybody's in the process now of trying to protect themselves because violence is a problem. And if I was in my bed sleeping and in the middle of the night, somebody tried to break my door down, I'd be scrambling to get my gun and return gunfire or beat them to it. And so bad policy. And so I'm glad that the Justice and Policing Act is taking a look at no-knock warrants. Now, what the Justice and Policing Act says is that no-knock warrants in drug cases. Yeah. I think we really should broaden that somewhat. And I know there are some situations that may call for no-knock warrants, but I personally believe we ought to even look more broadly. Yeah. I think what happened in Breonna Taylor's case was bad policy, TJ. Now, I wasn't on the ground. I don't know the circumstances. I know in our search warrants, whenever we serve search warrants, we always videotape. That was an internal policy. Probably all police departments don't do that. That would certainly help, I think, in cases, but I think it's bad policy, and I certainly think they need to look at their policy.
Yeah, well, I believe, I agree that we do need to do a complete diagnostic just on a whole scale of how policing is done. In Breonna Taylor's case, I think, in my personal opinion, I think it's clear that if Val Demings was laying in her bed, or Val Demings someone broke into Val Demings' house, or Congresswoman Val Demings' house and was shot, I would think that you would want those officers to be also held accountable. And I think it's important for our elected officials to say that and speak truth to power.
Yeah, but I also think it's important for not just elected officials, but for all of us to be fair. And I don't know enough about it. It's kind of like this, TJ. If you worked for a company and that company had bad rules, but you were responsible for going out and executing those bad rules or policy, should you solely be held accountable for that? And that's why I'm saying I think this is bigger than the officers on the scene. I think this is a bad.
I thought you were going to go Nino Brown on me. I thought you were going to say this is bigger than Nino. I thought you were going to say this is bigger than Nino Brown from New Jack City. Okay.
But I do think if we're going to do this one right, we got to make sure we look at the policy, because if the policy's wrong and we do nothing about it, then this can happen again and again and again. And we do not want that. Breonna Taylor and her family and her memory deserve better than that. So we've got to look at a higher scale.
Okay, absolutely. I purposely didn't start with the VP question because, as you've done so much press about whether or not you're going to be, whether you would accept being the vice president if asked, and you've clearly stated publicly, if called to serve, you will serve, right? So I'm going to ask it in a different way, and I want to. Do you feel that Vice President Joe Biden, because recently, let me go back. Recently, Amy Klobuchar withdrew her name from consideration to be the vice president or be selected to be vice president. And she said that a woman of color should be the next vice president or on the ticket. So my question to you is, do you feel that a Black woman should be on the ticket? Do you feel like a Black woman needs to be on the ticket for Joe Biden to defeat Donald Trump and become the next president of the United States?
TJ, you know what can I start here? Look at the conversation we're having. Isn't this, and take me out of the conversation. Now look, this girl who grew up poor, Black and female in the South is honored to have my name called. And I hope every little Black boy and girl is watching and listening. But don't you think it's time? And whether I am chosen or not, wouldn't it be wonderful when we look at historically the work that Black women have done for this nation? Let's go back to Harriet Tubman, man. You talk about somebody who was courageous. Not only did she had her freedom, but it wasn't enough. She went back and brought others. I just think history is saying that it is time. Shirley Chisholm, Rosa Parks, Coretta Scott King, Black women who were major parts of the civil rights movement, even though they didn't have the microphone. I just believe history is saying it is time to select a Black woman for such a critical time as this. And look, I'm honored to be considered. I'm honored my name is being called. That's the result of the work of all of the people before me who worked hard for me to have this opportunity to have my name called. But I think it's time. I think it's time.
Okay. But there have been critics, right? And the reason that I wanted to have this conversation with you, and I'm glad you took me up on the invitation, is because there have been critics. There are people who have been critical that, with Joe Biden's history with the 94 crime bill and that's a part of his history. And then there are people critical of you with the Protect and Serve Act, which is otherwise known as the Blue Lives Matter bill, which people have been critical of. How do you, in a potential Joe Biden, Congresswoman Val Demings ticket, how do you, with those backgrounds of with that legislation that's deemed to be detrimental to marginalized communities, how do you bridge the gap in this moment in time to ignite the base in order to defeat 45?
You know what, TJ, let me tell you something. We've got to defeat 45. And I want you to think about, I don't think you or I have ever voted for anybody who was perfect, who had all the right things, everything in their life was the right decision at the right time. They were perfect. And that's why you selected them. But I think you and I both, we vote and support people who we consider they have the right, whether it's information, the right passion, the right experience, they've been in the right places at the right time to fight the good fight. If you look at, number one, let me talk about the 90s, because I was at the police department in the 90s. And what I remember were the ability to be able to initiate community-oriented policing and establish neighborhood patrol units. And if you remember, those were the units that were assigned to some of the low-income housing areas. And they were just like the school resource officers in the schools. They weren't there for law and order. They were there to build the gap in the relationship. And out of that came summer youth programs for our children. Out of that came Christmas parties every year and Thanksgiving, food basket drives, and all of those great community-oriented things. That was the result of community-oriented policing that came about because of the additional funding and additional officers that came out of the 1990s. And if you watched me as a police chief, was I perfect? Of course not. Am I a perfect individual? No. And I hope that would be a plus to you as opposed of a downside.
I think a lot of people, saying that you're not perfect, you weren't perfect as a police chief, I think that's a positive step. I think really here, and I'll speak locally, people we're still dealing with some of the systemic problems within the Orlando Police Department that were implemented during your time as police chief, similar to the voices being, there's Orange County is #1 per capita in excessive force cases. You reduced the crime rate from 43.6%. However, excessive force complaints did rise. And
and I'm
gonna give you an opportunity because I want to make sure that you can articulate yourself.
Yeah.
Dealing with that and understanding that still now to this day with the citizen review boards, not a lot of the complaints not even reaching the citizen review board. A lot of people are still trying to differentiate between Orlando Police Chief Val Demings and Congresswoman Val Demings, who wrote, my fellow brothers and sisters in blue, what the hell are we doing? So how do we differentiate? Because there are still some, dare I say, healing that needs to go on before you potentially move forward as a contender for VP.
Yeah, and there's always healing that needs to go on, TJ.
Yeah. But is that a priority to you, that you feel like maybe you need to mend those?
See, that's the untold part, because I guess I'm not really one of those people who toot my own horn and say, hey, look at me, I just do the work. And I think my commitment to the community has gotten me with an overwhelming victory being elected to Congress and to be considered as a VP candidate, because I know a lot of people are saying, well, my goodness, how did that happen?
Yes.
When I was the police chief, and if you look at my level of policing, and if you look at the stats, and I know that there has been a lot of attention on excessive force at the Orlando Police Department, as there should be. There was a story that was done that covered time from 2010 to 2014, which a year and a half of that.
It was not you. Yes, I'm very much aware of that. Yeah.
My first year as chief, the use of force went down in every category. We don't hear about that. It went down in every category at the same time, while I was working hard to reorganize the department and put a plan together that kept people that looked like me from being murdered in the streets, to keep people that look like me from being victims of violent crime. You also know, if you look at my police, and I realized early on, we could not arrest our way out of the problems that we were having, right? That there was an alternative to taking people to jail. Look, I'm the mother of 3 Black sons. As I said earlier, I grew up poor, Black, and female. Who thinks that I forgot that? I also, if you look at my style of policing, while we were working hard to reduce violent crime, we also started more community programs and initiatives. I'll put my record up against any chief, and I worked for 7 chiefs. We did things like, as you know, we sponsored GED programs. We helped people with jobs and make better wages. We got counseling for kids when their parents were saying they hear gunshots all day long, and so they can't go outside to play and need counseling. We help people get better housing. That stuff has built playgrounds, and that stuff has nothing to do with police work. And I remember being criticized by some of my former fellow chiefs about doing that. But TJ, I felt like arresting people and putting them in jail was not the only answer, that we had to work hard to improve the quality of life for persons who deserved a second chance. And so I don't talk a whole lot about those things because, I started a youth mentoring program called Operation Positive Direction that was solely geared towards giving at-risk kids, predominantly Black boys and girls, an alternative to crime and other making bad choices. And so I'm real proud of those programs. And like I said, I'm not perfect, but doggone it, I sure worked hard.
I've heard you say that racism in this country is the ghost in the room. Right?
Yeah, because I've been a victim of it.
Yes, correct. As have I, and I think most Black Americans are. And I think we're getting to a point in this country where Black Americans are tired of, Black and brown, but specifically to the Black experience, are getting tired of seeing police officers kill Black Americans with impunity. So at what point do we start having some exorcism type legislation to protect Black Americans in this country from being racially targeted by those who and I want to preface it because I want to be careful with my words.
Yeah.
It's clear that we have a problem in this country with white supremacists who have infiltrated law enforcement to racially target people, African Americans in this country. So when do we pass legislation in order to protect these Black Americans?
And let me say this though, as I said earlier, we see systemic racism in all things.
Yep, housing, healthcare.
Housing, education, healthcare. Look at the response to COVID-19. And
Correct.
we know a disproportionate number of Black and brown people are the majority of the people who are dying. We see it in all things, right? Systemic racism has been the ghost in the room. And back to, you mentioned my op-ed, my brothers and sisters in blue, what in the hell are you doing? I just didn't come up with that. If you talk to people at the Orlando Police Department who were there when I was there, now some of them hate my guts, right? Because I was a chief that worked hard every day to be creative in terms of holding them accountable when the laws did not allow me to do what I wanted to do. And they can tell you about some creative ways I tried to do that. But if you talk to people, they know I talk to members of the police department every day about when they made stupid decisions or did stupid things, or I thought they were treating people wrong about those things, and tried to hold them accountable when I could. I'm excited though, TJ, about the legislation, because that's what we need. Police.
But does it go far enough? And I think that's been my criticism is the legislation
go farther than anything we have ever seen. And police and sheriffs, we know that there are 18,000 police agents.
When I say far enough, I mean as a deterrent, like as far as punishing, as far as prison time. Is it
what we need to do first? We need to try to keep racists out of the police departments. And if we can come up with federal standards as it pertains to hiring, whether you're a 10-person agency or you're a 36,000 person agency, if we have some federal guidelines where you just can't hire anybody, you can't hire your cousin or your brother or your brother-in-law or whomever you want to, and we can continue to professionalize the profession. Requiring all law enforcement agencies to go through accreditation can help do that. Not just if you want to, but make it a requirement that's codified in the law. Looking at hiring standards. Also, another one is looking at who train new police officers. Because remember, the department can have all the laws and policies it wants, but the training officers are the ones who set the unofficial standard for what's acceptable and unacceptable on the street.
Well, I agree with you, because if you look at George Floyd, Derek Chauvin, who was murdered, he was the training officer. So how do we? But he had a history of a long history of complaints. So, you know, how do we be how is it that we can become proactive in this country? Rather than, because people know I believe that's a bit of a myth that law enforcement agencies don't know the officers that are, you know, have racial bias or are racist themselves.
Well, this is what I say about racism. I used to say this to the officers at OPD. I said, look, when you're not under stress, you can fool me. Because when you're not under stress, you can try to be anybody you want to be, right? You can get in the crowd and hide, but under stress, who you truly are will reveal itself when placed under stress. And it goes back to the accreditation, requiring every law enforcement agency to be accredited. That's what gives you the teeth.
I just think, and I agree, I agree that there needs to be things like that. However, at what expense? Because when they have this revelation of who they are under stress, we get the Rayshard Brooks.
But
that's the
thing.
And we get the George Floyd.
When you could develop better hiring standards.
Okay.
See, how did, and you know, when you look at Tamir Rice, how did that officer get fired from one place and go and get hired at another place? Better hiring standards will prevent that. Having a national database will prevent that. Not allowing agencies to hire, like I said earlier, people you know. People you know can be fine, but that might be not be the person that needs to be,
Yes.
you know, having a badge and a gun with unbelievable authority. We
Well, I
need
think,
we need to hire the brightest and the best people.
and I think right now the conversation has shifted. And I heard you say in a quote, you said, our streets are not war zones. And so when I looked at that, my antennas went up, and I said, wait a minute. So are you in favor of demilitarizing the police departments across the country?
Well, let me say this. You do understand why police agencies went to, well, the federal government actually supplied the dollars many, many years ago,
Correct.
because many police agencies unfortunately found themselves outgunned on the streets. And we're not talking about decent neighborhoods. We're talking about people like the guy in the Pulse nightclub, for example.
Okay.
If you remember, it was some of the equipment that was purchased that would be considered military equipment that allowed the law enforcement to be able to breach the building and free people, rescue people, have survivors, more survivors. And so, but one of the problems that we've had, TJ, is, look, equipment is just like a gun. It doesn't kill people by itself, but in the wrong hands it does. Too much equipment has given out.
I agree. That's part of the quote.
Has been given out on the street without any training, you know.
But you know, they say absolute. You know how they say absolute power corrupts absolutely. But we're seeing a lot of militarized police, like we saw when President Donald Trump did his photo op, that in the streets of Washington, D.C., we have people being tear gassed. You see tear gas and militarized in here in Orlando. We've seen it in Tampa. We're seeing it all across the country where militarized police are going against civilians, people who are peacefully protesting. Is that the type of country that we want to see moving forward? Because I think the myth is that racism and the unrest ends with President Donald Trump. I don't believe it. I don't believe it does. And I do want to be respectful.
It didn't start with him. It didn't start with him.
Yes. So he's not the.
He hasn't helped. Now he has not helped.
No, he has not.
When you have a person with the biggest microphone in the world spewing hate and hateful statements and racist statements, that does not help. But it did not start with him. I think about the work historically that has been done, which we've talked about. When we look at the civil rights movement and the fact that we're still fighting for civil rights, it's more complicated than to say, well, the people in 1965 failed because we're still fighting against civil rights today. Or people who fought against racism didn't do a good enough job because we're still fighting. What we do know, TJ, as you well know, I know you know as an activist, racism is stubborn. Hatred is stubborn. Look at the fight against taking down Confederate statues. Anything that resembles or reminds us of some of the darkest, most hateful days in this country, why is there a fight about that? Racism and hatred is stubborn, and we have to do everything we can every day to work against it.
And you know what? I agree with you, but it's almost like I always say that politicians, if we're talking about service, right, and justice and equality, if this was a restaurant, politicians across the country would be not the best servers, because Black Americans are asking for justice and equality, and we're getting a lot of symbolism. A lot of the statues and stuff, they need to come down, absolutely. But I think we need to start turning the conversation into the economics of why institutionalized racism has marginalized these communities.
And I appreciate what you just said, because I'm reminded of a study that Lyndon Johnson did in 1965. He impaneled a commission to look at policing and crime in America. And he talked about, the commission had teachers on it, it had lawyers, it had social workers, and of course, law enforcement. And they concluded that Well, yeah, you got to hire the best policemen at that time, 55 years ago, they won't talk about men. You got to have the
Absolutely.
best training. But then they said, but you got to deal with poverty. You
Yeah.
got to deal with substandard housing. You got to
Mhm.
deal with homelessness. You got to deal with substandard education. As we talked about earlier,
Mhm.
discrimination and inequities in all things. You can't have one without the other. Now, I'm not going to say no progress has been made, because this is a fight we need to continue to fight. We've had, and look, I'm new to politics and I'm trying to do the best job I can, like I have in everything. But I think we've had some pretty phenomenal people in public service who
Mhm.
have helped to move the needle in the right direction. We're not in the same place we were 50 years ago or 100 years ago. But what we do know, we still got a heck of a lot of work to do.
We
And what
do.
we need to do is, as we have a president who tries to divide our country, one thing we need to do is unify together and work together. We might have different jargon or different tactics but we all want the same thing. And that's a better, more equitable America. It's the
Yeah.
same thing Dr. King and Rosa Parks and others and John Lewis was beat down for. It's the same
Yes.
thing that we're fighting for today.
Yeah.
And
And
I do feel, look, we got a lot of work to do. We're not
Mhm.
where we were, but it's something we cannot take our eyes off the ball.
Absolutely. And Congresswoman, I want to be respectful of your time, because I know that our time is limited, and we're going to have to invite you back onto
I was
the
just going to
the
say,
Soapboxx podcast, and not only extend an invitation to you, but whether it's Vice President Joe Biden, he's welcome on the Soapboxx as well. Usually here on traditionally on the Soapboxx, we call it the moral of the story. It's your opportunity, or our guest opportunity, to speak directly to the Soapboxx Nation, as we call it, or speak directly to your constituents. So I'm going to give you the floor and you'll do your moral of the story, and I'll do mine. And so what is your moral of the story? How can you summarize our conversation and put a bow on it to the
well,
people who are listening?
first of all, TJ, I want to thank you so much for this opportunity. Thank you for inviting me to have this important conversation with you. I think if we've learned anything in my lifetime, in your lifetime, you're certainly younger than me, is that America, and I'll call on the words of Jim Clyburn, who talks about America being great. We know America is great, but our job is to make sure that America's greatness is accessible to everybody. This fight for racial equality, gender equality, marriage equality has been a fight that has existed in this country for 400 years. We all have a role to play, whether you're in elected office, whether you're an activist, whether you're old or young, we all should be working hard for the same things. Now, let me say this. When you get in that arena, you're going to be the one that's battered and bruised and pushed around and all, but the credit still goes to the man and woman in the arena fighting the good fight. And so we can get there. I believe in the promise of America because I've seen it. I've seen it in the Women's Act. I've seen it in the Civil Rights Movement. I've seen it in the voting rights legislation that has been passed. We will get there, but we've got to get there together. So thank you for allowing me to tell the moral of the story.
All right. Thank you, Congresswoman Val Demings of Florida District 10. Thank you so much for joining me on the Soapboxx podcast. Hopefully this is not the last time we have a conversation, and best of luck to you down the road and your contendership for the Vice President of the United States.
Thank you so much, and good luck to you. Keep up the good work.
All right. Thank you. Will do. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, that is our episode of the Soapboxx podcast. Please be sure to follow us on Instagram, Soapboxx Podcast with 2X. That's Soapboxx Podcast with 2X. Also, like our Facebook page. Make sure you like our Facebook page. Share with your friends. We are also available on Stitcher, Spotify, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio app, and Spotify. So if you like this conversation, we have plenty of other conversations, authentic conversation to speak truth to power about social justice, pop culture issues, and so forth and so on. So thank you so much for everybody joining us. Thank you, Soapboxx Nation, and we will see you next time. Peace.